As the title of this post suggests, my grandfather had a habit of drinking and regaling me with his stories of war. He didn't talk much about the atrocities, the bad things, or the conflict, choosing to talk about the odd things that he had encountered during his time. "Tell me one of your war stories, Granddad," an 11-year-old me would beg, pleading to hear about the werewolf that he had encountered in Germany, or the ghost that he saw in France. He never complained or refused, and always let me stay up, just to hear one last story. He was a wonderful grandfather. Before each story, he would pour himself a glass of whiskey, light up his pipe, and spin his stories. I was his biggest fan, and he seemed to enjoy reminiscing about all of those old faces and friends long since gone. There was one tale, though, which he held close to his chest, a story that he did not speak of under any circumstance. For me, however, he made an exception. One day when I was still young, 12 or 13 perhaps, I said to him how I wanted to be just like him, and that when I was old enough, I was going to join the military. Fear splashed his face with a cold, stark, ghostly shade. His eyes, which had always been so kind and old, became furious and wild with fear. "Never say that. Promise me you won't. You promise me," he yelled, grabbing my arms and gripping me tight. I promise," I said, stunned by my grandfather's reaction. He had never behaved like that. Never once in all of my life had he raised his voice or his hand. I asked him why he didn't want me to join up, and his reply came, "War is hell, and hell is for the damned." My old grandfather wheezed. He let me go, poured himself a glass of whiskey. "I think we've still got time for one more story. A story that I will tell you once and never again. This is about what I had encountered in the trenches over in Normandy. About the thing that took all of my garrison," he said as he settled into his armchair, with his smoking pipe in hand. I sat at the foot of his chair, ready to listen, and I did. It is this story that he told me that I will now recite. Though I lack his storytelling abilities and eloquent wordsmithing, I will try my best to recount his tale. This is my grandfather's story. The year was 1942. The war had consumed most of the world. It was on fire, and my grandfather was barely a man as he marched with his comrades, who themselves were only young. They were Armstrong, Talbot, Caddy, Richards, and Newt, short for Newton. A new lad had just recently joined their garrison, a teary-eyed kid barely 15 years old. They nicknamed him the Wave, on account of him looking like a frightened child. Despite that, the group rallied around him, made him feel at home with them as best as they could. Of course, my grandfather already had close bonds with the others, especially his best friend Armstrong, a brutish-looking man, but who was really a gentle giant, rarely raising his fist unless he had to. As they settled in alongside their commanding officer and another troop in the trench, a fell wind blew in, carrying with it the carrion scent of death. That night the trenches fell eerily silent, as though some unseen hand had smothered each and every sound. My grandfather and Armstrong were the first to notice this, and began to question what was going on. It wasn't right. There was always noise. This was war. There should be shells exploding, rifle fire, and the cries of suffering men. And yet there was nothing. Not a cry, nor a whimper. Even the rats had seemingly vanished, as had the flies. They tried to get some shut-eye, using this rare moment of ceasefire and silence to relax. But there would be no respite for my grandfather. In his dreams, he stood atop a mountain of screaming bodies, gone beyond recognition. The battlefield around him was drowning in blood rain as great red fog rolled over it all, bringing with it the roars of volatility and the drumbeat of war. He sprung up from his sleep, barely rested, and found his superior standing over him commanding them to get up. He had a task for them. Their superior ordered them to do the unthinkable. They were to ascend from the trenches, walk across the no man's land ahead, and find out what was going on. This was a death wish, and my grandfather and his friends objected, asking why the officer and his group couldn't go ahead to investigate. The commander, with the veins bulging at his neck, told my grandfather that if he refused, he would be court-martial. My grandfather refused, and a small fight broke out between the soldiers. Nothing too serious though, just a few busted lips and a couple of punches thrown. Looking back, my grandfather described the fight as odd, really, because he had never been an aggressive person as such. That wasn't in his nature. He described the sensation that he felt in that moment, claiming it was like all of his blood was boiling and he could feel himself being compelled to not only disagree, but furiously denounce the authority of his commanding officer. The situation was calmed when the young wave begged them to stop, reminding them that the enemy is out there and not within their ranks. Peace resumed for a moment. Half-hearted apologies were passed around, but all the men, including the commanding officer, looked troubled by their own actions, as though they did not know what came over them. However, the commanding officer did also make a quip about Armstrong being my grandfather's boyfriend, causing Armstrong to almost lose his temper once more. Newton Caddy held him back and stopped him doing something that he would regret. Reluctantly, to keep the peace, my grandfather and his group agreed to climb over the trench and march across the savage waste. And so up they crawled, out of the thick mire below, into the gloom of the early gray dawn. The air was thick, muffled, and filled with fog. It was truly a haunting sight, a place one would expect to see ghostly apparitions dancing through the wind and the trees. But there were no ghosts, however. There was nothing but an unending carpet of decay. Even the crows had stopped picking at the dead, a sure sight that things had truly gone off the deep end. Climbing over shrapnel-shattered corpses, piles of rats, my grandfather led his fellow soldiers through the spiral barbed wire webs until they made it where they believed the Germans had been operating out of. Sliding down into the fetid trenches, a strong and metallic tang filled the air. It was a smell that my grandfather had become accustomed to. It was blood, and he soon discovered the source. Before them lay a gruesome sight. Men riddled with bullets, others torn apart and strung up upon barbed wire vines as though they were decorations. Atop the entrance to a dugout ahead of them was a spiral of limbs wrapped in metal thorns, and at its center was a horse's head. Newt expelled his guts at the sight, and the other men barely held theirs in as they gazed around the murky trench for signs of life. My grandfather found none. There was only more death. Soldiers in the garbs of the enemy decorated the site, like grotesque mannequins. My grandfather said that he had no shame in admitting that his heart was thumping from his chest and that the adrenaline racing through his body was telling him to run, to flee. Any normal man would, the voice inside told him. What could do this? Who could do this? Those were the questions my grandfather dared not ask, for knowing the answer was even more frightening than the unknown. That same fear was shared by the others, quieting what little bravery remained in the war-weary soldiers. However, deeper in the filth and fear they trudged, my grandfather's desperately trying to hold his nerve to hide his fear. The last thing that he needed was to worry the new lad, the Wave, whose skinny arms could barely carry his rifle as it was. Inside one of the dugouts, they discovered a commanding German officer, who wasn't in a much better state than the rest of the German soldiers. Another 2 men were lying on top of each other, locked in their final moments, each thrusting their knives into the other. Their eyes were bulging with hatred, and their faces were frozen in a rictus grin. Deciding that they had seen enough, my grandfather told the others that they were going back, that something wasn't right, this isn't right, and that they had to tell someone. It was at this moment that Newt began acting strange, clawing at his face and screaming, telling the voices to shut up. All of a sudden, his head sprung up, with the eyes of a madman. Newt aimed his gun at Talbot and fired a round into his shoulder. Shocked, the others demanded to know what he was doing, but Newt just called them enemies and future traitors, telling them that he was going to get it over with, to stop them now before they got to him. Laughing maniacally, he claimed the end was nigh and the Reaper would have his due, and ready to fire another round, this time at my grandfather. Believing that he was suffering from shell shock, my grandfather and Armstrong disarmed him, but Newt, in a wild flurry of mania, pushed past them and rushed towards the caddy, going at him repeatedly with his knife. Silver shine sparkled with each thrust of the blade, and though Caddy should have cried out, his eyes instead swelled with violent rage. "Traitor!" he yelled as he began returning the favor to Newt with his own knife. Locked in their deadly, mad embrace, the pair snarled like rabid hounds, froth dripping from their jaws and blood running their eyes. My grandfather commanded the others to leave, telling them to take Wave outside, to spare the lad this sight. A single shot ran straight through the pair's head, and their manic bodies folded into the dirt. Gasping, afraid and alone, he heard that voice again, that had previously told him to flee, and now had told him to hurt, to end the suffering, to trust no one. Though it was tempting to give in to this fear, he refused it once more, telling himself that his friends wouldn't betray him, nor he them, and the voice quieted for a time. Climbing out of the dugout, he was shocked to find the Wave clutching his head, balled up on the floor. Armstrong was gone, as was Richards. Only Talbot remained as he was in the process of wrapping barbed wire around his own face, screaming about silencing the war inside. You're just like the rest of them, always sneering behind my back, putting stuff in my food, trying to poison me. I know you want to take my girl. I know you plan to betray me," Talbot shrieked, as he bolted forward on all fours like a beast. Tripping over his own feet, my grandfather fell, landing deep in the squalid sludge. My grandfather denied all the claims, reminding him that he had never met Talbot's girl back home. Desperately, he tried to get through to his friend, but he was lost in his own derangement, swallowed in the red mist. Talbot jumped upon my grandfather, who in turn struck him with a fist and then picked up a nearby rock, clobbering him on the side of the head. It came to him again, that sneaky voice whispering. This time it told my grandfather that if he didn't end Talbot now, he would surely get back up and do the same to him. He had to strike first, strike before his fears came true. His instincts pleaded. My grandfather readied his rifle, but as he aimed it towards his altered friend, he could not bring himself to pull the trigger. Turning away, my grandfather said what happened next was truly disturbing. Talbot revealed a knife, but rather than rush towards him, he began sinking the blade into himself, over and over again. Shocked and disturbed, he left Talbot and grabbed hold of the Wave, dragging him up and over the trenches once more. Ahead of them, he heard the thunder of gunfire and the screams of men followed. He breathed in deeply, and with trepidation he made his way forward, his rot-riddled feet squelching into the thick mud. Dread swelled in him, fearing what lay ahead. What new horrors would blight his corneas? When he reached the trench ahead, it was filled with that coppery liquid, and that's not the worst part. The chaos, the paranoid madness was seemingly spreading further, as cries and gunshots echoed in the distance across the entire battlefield. He didn't know what to do. He was meant to be the strong one, the hero. He was a soldier, he shouldn't be afraid. But he was. He was deathly afraid, and he began to believe that there was no part of the world that would not be touched by this hateful influence. This terror was only amplified, for out of the darkness of the filthy trench emerged Armstrong, his most loyal friend. Now a hideous acolyte of pain, his body scarred with fresh cuts, his arms bound in razor-sharp wire, and in his hands, he carried the head of their commanding officer. "War is hell. You're all my enemies. Hell is for the damned," Armstrong exclaimed, before leaping at my grandfather, slashing wildly with a knife and tossing the officer's head onto the ground. Out of nowhere, Richard sprung up from the mud, coated in the grime and brandishing his rifle like a club. He swung its barbed wire-wrapped handle towards Armstrong's head, and their brawl began. They screamed and wailed about enemies being everywhere, about the true foe inside, none which made sense to my grandfather, who desperately tried to avoid the marauding madman. He had never seen such carnage, such deranged bloodlust. Slipping into the slush once more, my grandfather wept with fear, his whole soul freezing as Armstrong grabbed Richard's head and repeated slashing with his knife. Most disturbing of it all was that Richard just kept laughing, as if he was gaining some sick enjoyment. It was then that my grandfather did it. To silence the unhinged cackling of his crazed comrades, he fired, and letting Armstrong's lifeless face splat into the mud. Richard's barely living vessel, riddled with madness, looked to my grandfather, who fired again, taking him out also. Alone, coated in the blood of enemies and comrades alike, my grandfather gasped for air, begging God for some sort of miracle. However, none came. Instead, another replied. Behind him came a clapping, and when he turned, he saw that small, scrawny boy who could barely hold a rifle, grinning. My grandfather loaded his gun once more, believing too he was bewitched by the madness of this battlefield. However, the boy told him not to fear, that he shall be spared, so as to bear witness to this, his trial run. Realizing that the boy was behind this, my grandfather, whimpering but furious, charged at the boy. All his bravado was swiftly stripped from him, as flames erupted from the waif and a terrifying voice boomed and burned itself into his mind, searing visions into his head. Scenes of torn warriors, of conflicts yet to come, of poisoned water and noxious air that blistered the skin of thousands. He saw the world on fire and in the ashes, a scarred landscape chiming with the cries of a million widows. Falling onto the floor, my grandfather described the fear that he felt as a bone-aching terror. He dared not look up as the fire died down. When he finally gained the courage to look up, his face was met by the boy's pale mud-splattered smirk. His red eyes gleamed with an unimpressed expression. "You humans are truly marvelous little beasts. So wickedly cruel and so eager to take up arms against each other. Really, it's a miracle that you've lasted this long," the boy said as his childish shape shredded from him like embers on a pyre. My grandfather asked his name, but he needn't, for his name was clear for all to see. None could look upon him and not know his name. Where once a boy pale and 15 stood, now towered a great giant of a man. Entombed in a body of bronze and brass medieval plating, and atop this great warrior sat a gladiatorial helmet filled with flames. Behind him flowed a roaring red cape, and in him burned the unquenchable blaze of violent urges. "I am the rider of the red horse," a threatening and earth-shaking voice bellowed from the fearsome warrior. "I am the voice inside you all, whispering that it's okay to pick up the knife, to harm yourself or others. I am war, the ruiner of peace, the divider of lands," he thundered. "You mortals think these silly battles are wars. Please, this is nothing. The worst, most terrible wars are those that rage inside." The towering figure roared, his wrath blistering the skin of my grandfather's face. "The doubt, the fear, the self-loathing, and the paranoid, those are the kindling to my fire," War declared. His words were hot and sharp like molten knives. They cut deep, sending more ghastly images of horror into my grandfather's mind. Among them, great mushroom clouds and toxic smoke. "What do you want?" my grandfather whimpered, his lips and hands shaken from fear. "Nothing as of yet. Like I said, this is just a trial run. In fact, this conflict is coming to its end, but there's always more. Today it's Europe, tomorrow Vietnam, and the Middle East, and after that, the war will rage in your streets. For when I ride forth a century from now, I shall bring conflict to all. Nation will fight nation, fathers will fight sons, and on the violence will spill," threatened the tower of hateful scorn. My grandfather, with trembling hands, raised a rigid rifle, readied his bullet and went to fire, not out of bravery but out of fear. Fear for what would come if he didn't. Yet he had not the nerve to pull the trigger, and the fury of the entity before him was unleashed, shattering the rifle in his hands and throwing my terrified grandfather back. With violence pouring forth from his armored visage, War conjured forth and raised his mighty red sword, and with a swing, the scarlet heat descended. My grandfather braced himself for the sting of the scorching slash, but it never came. He scurried away like a frightened rat, his face stained with terror. He looked to the rider and watched as he disappeared his burning sword and whistled forth his terrible horse, a raging red steed, which rose from the trenches. Its molten hide was cracked and riddled with smoldering crags. Into its eyes, my grandfather gazed, and saw the same unhinged red veil that had consumed his fallen comrades. And then the great warrior shrouded himself once more, assuming the guise of a German officer this time, as he climbed atop his red steed. Before he could ride off to pollute the lands with his hatred and wrath, my grandfather demanded to know one thing. Why? Why spare him? Why not end him? And that is when War's final declaration came. "I don't need to. For many years from now, you shall have a grandson. He will adore you and you him. He will be your most precious treasure. One day, he shall follow in your footsteps, and when he steps upon his own battlefield, I shall visit unto him the punishment you were spared." War exclaimed, his words a fiery and wicked promise. With fearful tears spilling from his eyes, my grandfather cried out for the rider to punish him instead. But the red steed and the horseman atop it listened not. Instead, they charged ahead, vanishing across the war-scarred horizon, never to be seen again. So you see, that's why my grandfather was so hesitant to tell me the story, and even more fearful that I might join the military. He did not wish for the promise of that rider to be fulfilled. As an adult with children of my own, I understand his protective concern, but I don't think I put much stock in my grandfather's whiskey-scented old war stories. Having said that, I decided against a job in the military, opting for a career in law enforcement so I could remain in my hometown. It's not so bad here. The worst that we get is a couple of bar brawls and domestics. I've just found out that tonight's going to be a little different. We're going to be sent to keep the peace at one of the gatherings going on. Tensions are high on the streets at the moment, and the news is describing the scene as a battlefield.